seems to me that A, it might be time to have some topics that you choose to affiliate to and go to, and B, not to have rapporteur, but to have more of a free-for-all, but with limited time to do it, okay? So here's my suggestion. There are, again, following Kate's Trinitarian modus vivendi, we have 3 topics. Each topic has 2 groups associated with it, but you self-select, but we need to have a limit of about 6 per group still, right? And then you do whatever you do with the writing instructions that I fiercely impose upon you, and then you come back, and then it's more of a free-for-all with, say, 15 minutes or whatever allocated to each topic. So let's just try that, and then we can see whether it seems to be good for tomorrow, all right? So the 3 that I thought emerged out of the discussion, and I decided not to go regional in quite the way the papers were, simply because it's not clear that that would articulate to the interests and knowledge bases of a large number of people, but rather by thematic content. So I thought, so can I have maybe 12 hands to be in a group talking about IP, intellectual property, as broadly construed or narrowly construed? Who would be interested in being in that?
We hear all the time. I wanted to ask a general question for those people who know more about this than I do, about the status of the conversation on cultural exception and cultural specificity. If anybody could enlighten me about how current that is, how relevant it is, and how would it apply to the conversation we've been having on creative industries now. Well, as the little I understand from having read a few things on it and having taught on it, but never having done any research on it, is that these 2 concepts have been used for in international agreements and the efforts leading to international conventions that are supposed to produce the kind of laws and treaties that will regiment international relations on these issues. The Europeans pioneer, and I get the things mixed here, pioneer the idea of cultural exception, that is to say that the realm of culture would be exempted from the regulatory frameworks regulating commerce. So that culture would be an exception to that kinds of neoliberal free trade agreements. The idea of cultural specificity is slightly different in the sense, as I understand it again, that culture needs its own specific rules in order to be fairly traded. So that's the little I understand of it. But I wanted someone else to tell me how, if anybody knows, if this is still, I'm talking about readings I did a few years ago, and I have no idea in the international arena whether these are terms that are current or these are discussions that have already been regulated in treaties that did away with the terms of the discussion.
The exception was negotiated in the 86 to 94 Uruguay round, right, that created the WTO. And it was spearheaded by Canada and France and Canada. And it was given a 10-year lifespan until the next round, which has been going on, in which it would be considered whether or not culture would become traded, right, like any other commodity, instead of being exempt. In the meantime, part of this there's side issues like bilateral free trade agreements like between the United States and Chile, where Chile negotiated what's called the cultural reserve, which meant that all the laws that allow subsidies and protections and so on and so forth that already exist can remain, but that within that agreement, no new laws. For example, in the case of Chile, there were no the existing laws did not cover digital rights on the media, for example, so that all that was left to be included in trade, so with no protection. At the same time, there was an initiative afoot to find an alternative to or a counter to the impending inclusion of culture in trade. And so the UNESCO people began thinking of this question of cultural diversity. And there's a convention, it's called Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. The United States joined the discussions, watered down the language, including a phrase, a set of articles that basically specify that defeat the purpose of this convention, which is that the Cultural Diversity Convention will not trump other international conventions, namely the ones that have to do with trade. And then the United States pulls out. The United States, Israel, Nicaragua, and the United States and Israel vote against. I think Nicaragua and Honduras abstain or something like that. And 148 countries vote in favor. And what the lawyers who deal with this convention are trying to figure out is in what ways they can jockey to make this convention have a little bit of teeth. It's not so clear that it can. So I'm not sure that cultural diversity will, and I really don't know, maybe Toby knows what the outcome, the likely outcome is in trade talks around this issue. But I haven't kept up on that part of it. I've been focused on the convention, of which it's still afoot. I mean, people are being hired, all kinds of coalitions in many different countries have been formed in order to try to get their governments to enforce these questions, so on and so forth. Some of them are quite active. All right.
Okay. Terry. Part of what our interests will, my interest maybe, is the ways actually that or IP sort of regimes are not only enforced officially and unofficially, but the way they can be actually usurped, if even momentarily. In other words, kind of what I'm getting at is the artist as, the subversive who, uses the Nike logo and in another way sells T-shirts that say the word vegan in the style of the Nike logo and whatnot. But more specifically, I wanted to talk about artists who appropriate, usually in photographs, but also video and film, appropriate directly from popular culture, movies, whatnot, and who actually, as far as I can tell, for the most part, with some exceptions, get away with this appropriation. In other words, they're not chased down legally. But even more than that, they sell their works in the art market for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So in my mind, in a certain sense, they are, and maybe even in some small way, sort of taking a little bit of that IP and making it their own kind of intellectual property. And I'm trying to sort of contrast that against other sort of maybe adjacent practices, say social documentary, remix culture, sample music, stuff like that, where there is this kind of fear of sampling, if you will, whereas in some strange way, and at least in my experience, I found that a lot of people in the art world don't have that fear of being chased legally, and in fact there's a very healthy discourse of appropriation, and in fact I should say there's a healthy discourse of appropriations, but it's always in a much more kind of post-structuralist, death of the author kind of representation discourse. It's not a legal one at all. Like, what are the ramifications of what you're doing in terms of intellectual property? So that's kind of...
That seems like a good spot to move on to music.
You don't want to hear about my concern?
Right. So I've got a feeling I'm going to.
Well, no, I was just going to say real quick that the other thing we talked about was whether we should complicate the kind of romantic promise of the Creative Commons.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain, does everybody know about what Creative Commons is? How many people could ask don't know what Creative Commons is? Everybody knows, it's all right. No need. Just go ahead.
But that's just kind of it in a nugget. What kind of mythologies and politics underlie and inform the kind of positive ways in which we we frame the Creative Commons in discussions like this.
Right. And of course, one of the underpinnings that's important to that artist arrogation that you were talking about in the United States is that actually, whatever they think they can do artistically, they are protected by the First Amendment if what they're appropriating is regarded as social commentary. So they can be as fancy pants post-structuralist as they want, but the reason they're allowed to get away with it is not to do with that at all. Okay, so let's go on then to music and technology and this idea that picks up on what you were saying of appropriation, of sampling and so on, and where obviously there's been such a spectacular cultural crisis, industrial crisis, as well as opportunity occasioned by new technology, new forms of labor and different legal regimes. Anybody want to offer anything from those groups?
In our group, we talked about a lot of the new media and how music is infused into that and the implications that has. We got into a lot of specific manifestations this takes, people making their own music videos on YouTube, how iTunes restricts your choices, how your choices are cataloged by some mysterious computer program somewhere else, so that your particular commercial message can be tailored to you. And we started right toward the end talking about online subjectivity, and I guess I just had a thought. I mean, it wasn't a thought I got to raise in the group at all, but maybe I can raise it here. Is this? Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Getting interference from there. Thanks. The commercialized subjectivity really seems like it's illusory. If your subjectivity within civil society is not substantiated by civil society, I think there's a sense in which a population that has ontological presence, whose lack of consent within civil society throws civil society into a crisis, their subjectivity is confirmed. But I think if one has an ontology of absence, if one can be murdered by agents of the state, with impunity, the state which exists ostensibly to protect the subject, if one's ontology is one of absence, it seems to me that electronic subjectivity creates an elusive subjectivity, and that serves particular ends that I thought were interesting, but I just had that thought.
I guess the comment that I brought up actually in our IP group, and that I find, I play in a band and I do a record label, and so these sorts of issues come up sometimes, mainly because the scene of music that I play in is largely, ignorant, if not disdainful of IPR and various issues along those lines. And it just occurred to me that it might be worth noting that the primary good that most bands want, as opposed to in this particular sort of scene, if you will, is exposure. And that there are certain services, like, for instance, Last.fm, that recently implemented a royalties payment program, which has actually benefited a lot of bands, but that also has some sort of issues with it as well, because it does adhere in ways that don't conform, adhere in ways to the copyright law, I'm presuming, because I'm not a legal expert here, that don't conform to the way that a lot of the bands that would be involved with this sort of thing actually think about their music. And so that the rights, for instance, are in a typical arrangement, apparently, I'm told, initially go to for a recording, initially go to the producer and then are assigned to a record label. Whereas most of the arrangements that go on between DIY type of bands occur on a handshake basis. Their represses are largely governed by that sort of thing, and occasionally you'll get arguments about these sorts of things, but there's generally a sort of ethics that is attached to the music that just doesn't hold once you get up to the upper echelons of actual IPR complications. And so Last.fm is a weird site because you end up having a lot of bands with these sorts of characteristics next to other more officially oriented acts. And in any case, I guess the main point that I wanted to make about that was that the crucial sort of juncture there is on exposure, and it's on communications infrastructure, and the way that advertising is used as a subsidy for those sorts of infrastructures, but that in the desire for the value that of exposure that companies like Last.fm or services like Last.fm can provide, it provides a means of sort of extraction of value or exploitation, if you will. I think that might be a heavy word for this particular circumstance, but nonetheless, it's accurate. I lost my sentence. I think I'm done anyways.
Actually, Toby, I just wanted to make, I wasn't in a music group either, but I wanted to just make a very quick observation. Yesterday in the LA Times, and I think since we were all here, maybe many people didn't get to read it, but there was an article about a band, sort of confirming what you're saying, that claimed that they had this brand new album and that somebody had stolen one of the songs and put it on the internet and allowed it to be available for piracy. So they were demonstrating for a while a lot of anger. We've been stolen, we've been pirated, but then they were also selling a discounted video that would go with the pirated song, and it was revealed that in fact one of the band members had actually released the thing. So both playing on the fame, playing on the piracy, playing on all of this stuff, in the same realm about how this...
And Hollywood's dirty little secret is that it loves so-called piracy, because it means that you get free marketing all over the world of your product, and that habituates people to what you're offering.
Hello. Actually, we agreed that we were all tourists here. We've all come from afar. I guess we talked about how tourism both draws on existing cultures as well as creating new cultures, and we kind of talked about the different ways that tourism created new cultures. Self-orientalism was a word that came up, I think, over here. The way that tourism sort of directs how culture should be manifest. We talked about new fake indigenous cultures being created. We talked about hippie cultures that arose in new locations. So kind of different ways that culture is manifest. The other thing I thought was interesting is that we talked about different types of tourism and how sort of the modern tourism experience is about trying on new subjectivities. So everything from sex tourism to ecotourism to whatever, going off and trying to be an Indian somewhere. So that was kind of the interesting bits.
No, it's just, we had actually, and I want you also to add, yeah. You raised a very interesting point. So, no, I was just wondering about this tension between, much of cultural tourism banks on authenticity of culture, and, long ago, Benjamin talked about this dichotomy between authentic culture and mass production. And somehow tourism industry seems to have resolved this contradiction in some sense. Authenticity and authentic culture is mass produced, and how is it possible? And I was just wondering how it was possible, and he gave a wonderful reply to that, and I think, he'll take it up. And our second point, of course, different types of tourism we talked about, and also to see tourism as both inside cultural industries and something that drives cultural industries. It reshapes the cultural context, and it is a commodity in itself. We have to probably approach to tourism in this sense. That was a minor point, but he has.
No, it's just that in responding to the question of authenticity, I gave an example of those, the theming, we were talking about the theming, the Chinese theming of cultural products, and I gave the example of the industry pharaonic theming in producing those pharaonic theme parks. And for tourists, both local tourists and Western tourists, and the issue becomes not one of authenticity or verisimilitude to an original, which is basically 5 minutes from the simulacra, right? You can go to the real pyramids, but people choose to go to the simulated version of it, and but it becomes this safe space where people can experience the culture in a simulated way. Same thing about Vegas, and someone gave the example of Las Vegas, and so yeah, this is the example.
difference. Yeah, I mean, if you're young, no, but no, I mean, we were talking about like Europeans, how they enjoy. What is that? How many Europeans enjoy themselves going to Chiapas and spending a month there, living with the Chiapanecos and with the indigenous people, and then they go back to Europe and they say, "Oh, you know what? I had the great experience of my." I mean, how much? Who are those people? I mean, which age level are they? Also, people who are traveling with families. You know, that makes a huge difference too. You know, we were talking about safety. How people tend to choose to go to safer places than others. For example, many Spanish and also Europeans, they say, okay, we're going to go to Africa. So and instead of going to even Tangier in Morocco, they go to Ceuta, Melilla, which is still Spanish enclaves in Africa. You know, so we had to differentiate between different kind of tourists, and that's one of the things we also discussed at that.
Can I just jump in? Because I think one of the interesting things when we're talking about tourism, people tend to think about tourists first and foremost rather than the industry as a source of employment. And in many regards, the degree to which tourism conforms to the creative industry's model derives more from the patterns of employment within it. Tourism as a place-based form of development, you know, jobs that can't be transferred elsewhere, and a whole hierarchy of employment within any site, which goes all the way from, you know, back office people's suits to the client-facing people who have to be very performative and have to be, in essence, the creatives in the industry. And it seems to me that it rather than the tourist experience as such for consumers and clients, it's more the experience of employment in this regard that makes it more of a creative industry.
I gave the example of a friend of mine, anthropologist, is writing her dissertation on these cultural, in Chinese, southern China, these cultural tourist zones that have been officially designated as, you know, the representative Hakka community. So people come and flock and see them doing their ethnic dances and eat their ethnic food and, you know, are privy to their ethnic rituals or what have you, considering that China has 55 minorities. And so the tension that we were talking about in terms of tourism vis-a-vis the cultural industry was the creation of new identities that comes out of the tension between the authentic and the representation and the production of culture. So that these people within this particular village had so many problems because they had to negotiate how to deal with the money that they got from the local government to create this tourist zone. And the leader was doing such and such things wrong, so they would you know, instead of singing this part, he would sing something different. I mean, they had all kinds of tensions that they had to renegotiate in the production of their ethnicity for a cultural tourist consumption. And so the consumption, in effect, I think, creates for questions of identities and new cultural identities, whether they're local, ethnic, national, transnational. And that's something that we were talking about in our group, or I was talking about in my group.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. A tourist isn't a migrant in a sense. A tourist isn't being driven from one place. A tourist is experiencing their mobility as a condition or as an expression of their freedom. And so it's interesting that now when we have places like Fortress Europe or the Mexican-American borders becoming so militarized, at the same time we have this tourist boom. And so that's something we talked about. We also talked about tourism being different at different scales of experience, so that I brought up the example of gay tourism in the Castro, which is now not as important as it used to be because gay culture is diffused across America in a variety of different ways. And so it's historically specific to different scales, so that nations have different demands of tourism than cities do, than specific industries do. And so one of the questions that we had was, what does that then pose as a challenge for the humanities? How are we then to think about tourism? What is the task the humanities have when confronted with that range of diversity? And we didn't answer that question.
I'd like to pick up on what you were saying about sort of self-exoticization and but what you're talking about, yeah, and the kind of performing of a particular identity. But I guess maybe because I'm still trying. Can we think about that as? I'm wondering because I'm thinking of this as a kind of service industry work, you know, and I'm just wondering. I mean, does anyone know of studies that have looked at people who perform these kinds of identities for tourists, and what kind of conditions they might have, and how does this affect their subjectivities? I'm wondering if anyone might know. I mean, another point I wanted to make is I feel like it's quite easy to sort of make this binary between the kind of privileged tourist and then the the oppressed migrant. You know what I mean? But I'm wondering if I guess maybe I'm stuck with this question again of who is a tourist, and maybe there are many, you know, and I mean we know there are many different kinds of tourists, and some are more privileged than others. But I don't know. I'm wondering how we could maybe engage with this in a more. I'm wanting to know more, maybe empirical questions like who are these people and where are they going, and you know, because it's not just sort of because I keep thinking it's not just always the privileged white European or sort of, you know, American going to that exotic place. I mean, there are many different forms of tourism. Anyway, I'm getting quite tired, so I'm kind of incoherent.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to say that in answer to your question about who's a tourist is I'm a tourist. I think there's a lot in this debate about people do this and they do this, and I'm an unashamed tourist, and I've been and taken photos of places and been on the tour bus and seen the performative stuff, and I think sometimes that's breaking down that kind of identity thing would be sort of useful in some ways. It's not just other people who are tourists, it's us.
There is a particular kind of African American tourism around heritage, going back to Africa. Good book about that called "Lose Your Mother" by Saidia V. Hartman. Talks about her experience with that and how it really kind of confirmed her non-subjectivity, I guess, essentially. Yeah, so that's one book.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks very much to Andrew and